Today we're joined by Richard McGregor, former Beijing Bureau Chief and current Washington Bureau Chief with the Financial Times. Thank you for joining us, Richard.
A pleasure.
In your career, you've investigated and reported on a rapidly changing China. Out of all of the economic and political shifts that you've observed in recent history, what do you think is probably the most significant decision that you've seen?
Well, I mean, it's a very obvious thing to say, but economic reform in China, it doesn't just affect China, it affects the whole world. You know, it's often thought about, you know, if China collapses, this would have a dramatic effect on the world. In fact, China has a much more destabilizing impact on the world if it rises, if it gets richer, if it gets more powerful. Now, that's not, I don't mean destabilize in a pejorative sense, it's just a fact, because the world will have to accommodate a much more powerful China. And the root of Chinese power, I mean, if China is going to become a superpower, a military power, economic reform has to succeed, and it has so far. So I think the biggest, earthquake, global earthquake of the past 30 years is successful Chinese economic reform.
Do you see China taking a role as a global leader, even more so in the future? Is that inevitable?
In different ways, yes. Not like America. I mean, the US has a sort of messianic, slightly missionary sense of its own power. It thinks its values apply to other people, we can have a debate about that. China, I think, is different. I mean, you can already see China becoming a global superpower, but in a different way. Let me give you one example. I mean, China, for example, in the past 30 years, as they've grown, they've been great joiners. You know, they joined the IMF, the World Bank, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, the WTO, etc. That's the nice view. But you look at China's also setting up a whole sort of parallel set of institutions with itself as the leader. Most recently, the Chinese, the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank, but you've got the BRICS Bank, you've got the Shanghai Cooperation Forum. So it's almost like China is going on two tracks. It's part of global institutions, but it doesn't trust global institutions. It thinks they're Western institutions. And it's also at the same time constructing its own reality, if you like. So yes, it will be a superpower, but not in the same way as America. The other, I think, big difference is that China's, I think, ambition is to be the regional hegemon, to use the word that they like to use so much. In other words, as the power in the Asia Pacific. It would like its own Monroe Doctrine to say to the US, this is our side of the Pacific, that's your side, and let's just carve it up like that. So I think they're the two main centres of growing Chinese power.
Leading from that question of growing power and China's changing role, when China puts itself out as a leader, it also opens it up to criticism. China's recent efforts in sending assistance to West Africa to deal with Ebola, for example, is being criticised as having an economic motivation rather than a humanitarian motivation. Do you think that's fair criticism?
I had not seen that criticism, and if that were the criticism, I don't think that is fair. I thought the criticism of China that might be fair with Ebola is that it wasn't, fast enough and big enough. But that's a double-edged sword, remember. Let me give you one example about that. You might remember the tsunami of a few years back, Christmas Day and New Year's Day in Southeast Asia, and of course that was a great example of American power, because the Americans were able to have, the aircraft carrier, large, logistics planes delivering supplies very, very quickly, and people pointed out, well, China was not able to do that even if it wanted to help. But just imagine if China was able to do what the Americans were able to do in a couple of days with their military, then people might not be so happy about that. So, I think, China has been an Asian power, a power in Africa in the 60s and the 70s, and it's really just going back there now. And I don't think helping out on Ebola is going to pay much economic dividends. I think, on the other hand, if China can help, if it has global capacity to help in a crisis like that, well, that can only be a good thing.
Absolutely. So we've recently seen the midterm elections here in the United States, and we now have a United States Senate that is controlled by the Republican Party. Do you think that will change the US and China's relationship?
I don't think it will appreciably. And there is an argument, of course, that the Republicans the Chinese prefer to deal with the Republicans, who are a bit more tough-minded, have a bit more clarity about them, and certainly are much more pro-free trade than the Democrats are. So there's an argument that the Republicans in control of Congress will be good for Asia and good for the China relationship generally. But I also think that people perhaps overlook that between White Houses there's a fair degree of continuity in US-China relations, which is not to say that relations are good always, but I think between administrations, the George W. Bush administration is not very different from the Obama administration in terms of policy. Just the times are different and the emphasis on issues might be different. And also, frankly, think that the Chinese have become much better at reading politics on Capitol Hill, and can call that they know what noise is. There's a lot of noise in Washington, and I think they know what to react to and what not to react to, and when not to overreact as well. So I don't think the midterms have a really big long-term or even short-term implications for US-China relations.
So we've also just recently seen China and the United States close a climate deal, or a deal to cap emissions together. What significance do you think that has globally and for their relationship?
I think it's pretty significant actually on a number of levels. First of all, I do believe that the US and China are strategic long-term rivals with the potential to clash, and I don't think that's changed. But what this deal does tell you is that both countries, both leaders, Xi Jinping in particular as the newer leader, are willing to work together in areas that they can work together. And climate change is a big one. This is an example of where G2 might actually work. There's a lot of debate about the figures in the deal, whether it's kind of easy for both countries. They're on track to do this already, particularly as the US is moving to more gas instead of coal. They can meet this target. The Chinese can also meet this target. But unless the US and China did this deal, then there'd be no real discussion for a global deal next year. There'd be no pressure on India. And certainly there might be a little bit more pressure on on Australia and Canada, which are increasingly outliers amongst Western countries on this issue. So I think it's more the medium is the message. The fact that they did the deal rather than the details of the deal itself are pretty significant and pretty interesting.
Turning now to Hong Kong. Do you think there will be an impact from the democracy protests that we've seen recently in Hong Kong on the mainland in China?
I don't think there's a short-term impact on the mainland in China. There's not great agitation on the mainland in China for elections tomorrow. That's partly because everybody knows that's not going to happen. Hong Kong is different. There's a timetable set out in the Basic Law for universal suffrage in 2017. Hong Kong is a very different place from the mainland. It has a very different sort of history and culture. So, but I don't think that spreads across the border. Guangdong has had access to Hong Kong TV media for a long, long time, and it hasn't, turned itself into a mini Hong Kong. It's still much under the control of the central government. Where I think there is an impact is in Taiwan. Taiwan has presidential elections, I think, in early 2016. Taiwan's pretty much a 50-50 nation or country, whatever you want to call it. It's quite possible that the DPP, the opposition party, Taiwan already has its Sunflower Movement, which is a precursor to the Hong Kong's Umbrella Movement. This could really be, and China's reaction to Hong Kong could really help the DPP, I think, in the election in Taiwan, and see the KMT turfed out of power. And then we'll have to see what the reaction in Beijing is to that, because the KMT in the past 6 to 8 years and Beijing have had a very good relationship. They're very quiet. It's been very successful. I don't think the head of the DPP is in any way similar to Chen Shui-bian. She's a much more straightforward individual, but there might be a backlash in Beijing to the DPP winning.
You've written extensively on how the Chinese Communist Party functions. Has the leadership under Xi Jinping affected the role of the party and corporate, academic or other aspects of Chinese public life?
Well, all the signs is that under Xi Jinping the party has got stronger, or they've attempted to make it stronger and tougher on its members. You know, it's politics, there's a tightening cycle in politics in China, and maybe it's more than just a cycle, it's tighter for some time to come. And you can see that through the anti-corruption campaign, you can see that through the tighter controls on think tanks and the output. Even on the economic debate, I think there's an expectation that it not take place in a noisy fashion. You know, there's an expectation if you want to sort of make your point, you do it through the proper party forums. So I think the system has been tightened under Xi Jinping, and I think it's interesting because I think, you know, from my last trip to China, I think there are many senior officials, many cadres who don't like Xi Jinping because he's been very tough on them, whereas his anti-corruption campaign amongst people more generally is much more popular. But, you know, bottom line is the party is as resilient as ever.
Russia's recent actions in Ukraine has been met with condemnation from Europe and the United States. Has this affected China and Russia's relationship? Well,
it hasn't, much to the disappointment of Washington. They have not got the support they wanted from China. Obviously the China, Russia, or the Moscow, Beijing, or the Putin-Xi Jinping axis is you know, an issue which is getting a lot of attention in Washington and elsewhere. In other words, about whether it's genuine building of an alliance or whether it's merely transactional. In other words, you know, oil deals, gas deals, arms deals and the like. I mean, just before, for example, I think the annexation of Crimea, I think Russia was selling subs to Vietnam. You know, Russia has been doing all sorts of deals, and I think the big deals that they've done with China recently have tended to overshadow that. I think this is much more a transactional relationship, but certainly from a Western perspective, you want to watch this very, very closely because, you know, Russia is part of the new global reality, which, you know, China is helping very powerfully to create. And whether they can get a genuine trust, because there's not much trust there, or there certainly hasn't been much trust there, is something we all need to watch.
In a Huffington Post piece you wrote in 2010, you said, "For all the glittering modernity of its coastal cities, the remarkable and largely overlooked truth about China is that it is still governed on Soviet hardware." Do you think that's still the case?
Oh yes, definitely, yeah. I mean, the core of the Chinese system is still you know, as designed by Lenin, and I think that all my book was trying to do was to try and point that out in a clear fashion, because I don't think people kind of realise that. And you're not making a value judgment by doing that, but you know, the Chinese, frankly, have not set the system up for you to see that. It's very secretive. So it's like the shorthand way of describing the Chinese system is the 3 Ps. You know, China's economy has been vastly liberalised. People's private lives are much freer than they ever were these days, and much better because they're richer. But in politics, there's a little bit that sits at the centre like kryptonite that you can't touch, and that's the 3 Ps. The PLA, which is the party's army, not the country's army. Personnel, which is the organisation department. The party has the right to hire and fire just about anybody important in the country. And propaganda, which is the media. The media is obviously a lot wilder these days in China and more interesting because it's more commercial, but on core issues of sovereignty and core national policies, the media has to toe the line. And so all those instruments of power are essentially Leninist instruments of power, and the genius of China, in a funny way, has been to preserve them and make them work.
Where do you see the future of the Chinese Communist Party in the near term?
In the near term, I think it's onwards and upwards. You know, I think that China will continue to grow. I'm not sort of Pollyannish about the problems they have, but I think China can keep growing at a pretty steady clip until, you know, 2020, 2025. After that, who knows what's going to happen. You can pay all sorts of very smart people and they'll pretend to tell you what's going to happen in China in 10 years. Nobody has any idea, I think. The most likely scenario, I mean, I'm very much of the resilient authoritarianism school. I think the system there is very resilient. It has enough winners amongst it. It's been successful enough. It's kind of like, you could disband the Communist Party, but if you did that, it's like disbanding the Iraqi army after the war. You have to put it back together again because there's nobody else who can do the job. So I think the party stays in power for the more foreseeable future. I think China's going to have big problems on a number of economic levels. 2025, 2020, there's a big demographic crunch. There's environmental issues. I'm not saying the whole show falls apart, but things get a lot harder when the economy when economic growth starts to flatten.
Will structural reform, do you think, at that point, or perhaps in the near term, in the next decade, be a part of the CCP?
Well, in theory, it's happening now. This was the big message of the last party plenum, economic reform. In theory, Xi Jinping's corruption crackdown is very much part of a broader policy package of cleaning up the party to make the bad medicine of economic reform more palatable. On top of that comes legal reform of sorts, Chinese style, not a Western style legal system, but some fairer, more transparent legal system that people can have faith in. I mean, China has big structural reforms ahead of it. But I think in the past, people have always underestimated their ability to get things done. We just have to see what happens in the next 5-10 years on that.
So to finish, I just wanted to reflect on your journalistic career. What are some of the difficulties that you've experienced in your journalistic career with China, and how did you overcome them, if possible, if you were able to?
I try not to. China can be a very hard place to report in. I think one of the biggest issues is that people, particularly in government, are under constraints. They are not free to talk to you openly. Working for a paper like the Financial Times, our scrutiny by the secret police is not as great as others. If you're looking at banks' non-performing ratios, then the poor old secret policeman around the corner doesn't really understand that anyway. But there's a lot of pressure on you in China from various forces. There's a lot of pressure, particularly on the Chinese who work for you, who are much more vulnerable than you are. It's such an exciting place and such an exciting story that far overcompensates for that. I also think, as a journalist, and what I always try to do in China is just write about China like you would any other country. In other words, don't be spooked, don't self-censor, make sure you get it right, give it a proper balance, and just do your job. And if you get up every morning and just do your job, I think that's all you can do.